Hello again, everyone. So this is the second makeup lecture for my personal morality course in the fall of 2022, related vaguely to sexual ethics. This was a really short reading on just the ethics of pornography. I mainly assigned it because I wanted you all to get a bit of an overview of some of the main arguments related to whether or not the creation and consumption of pornography is morally permissible. So, despite this title page, there will not YouTube would surely flag anything if I showed any examples or anything even remotely risque. So there won't be anything like that. But I'm going to take it for granted that probably everyone viewing this who should be an adult has some idea of what pornography is and where you might locate it in the digital age. Now, before we go and talk about a few of the arguments, I want to lay out two main terms. Eduardo Salazar talks about both of these and defines both of them in the context of his essay. The first one is sexually explicit material. He defines this as any depiction of explicit sexual acts in a variety of mediums with the intention of arousing an audience, reader, and or viewer to sexual stimulation. So this is a very broad definition. It could apply to sexually explicit content that falls under the category of erotic art. It could also fall under the category of pornography. Interestingly, this particular description probably wouldn't apply to certain kind of educational material. The kind of stuff you might see in sex ed, like instructions on how to use a contraceptive or something like that, because there wouldn't be any intention of arousing the audience or the reader. It'd be more informational. So it does rule out certain kinds of material that might involve nudity or a discussion of sex, things like that. Now, pornography is the main topic of this short little overview article or essay. And here's what Salazar says about that. Doesn't really give like a super explicit definition like he does for sexually explicit material. What he says is pornography historically has been associated with sexually explicit material that was labeled as obscene. So when the use of the term pornography started to gain traction a couple hundred years ago, this was usually what people were talking about. So pornography was associated with obscenity. Obscenity was like material that was specifically designed to cause offense, but this was a very slippery standard in many ways. It's the kind of thing where when you witness it or observe it, you might have a very strong intuitive reaction or intuitive suspicion that something was obscene, but you might not. But there might not be any like hard and fast objective criteria that are put forward to explain exactly what it means. In other contexts, particularly in the feminist tradition, pornography has specifically been defined as sexually explicit material that causes harm, and typically coming out of the feminist tradition, harm to women. I also recall many years ago when I was serving as a teaching assistant for a human sexuality class that sometimes pornography is simply defined in those texts as sexually explicit material that is evaluated negatively in some very, very broad sense. Now we're going back in time when I was like taking that class like over 15 years. I'm not sure that definition would hold up to scrutiny now because there seems like the connotations with the term pornography have changed over time. I'm not sure if everybody would accept the idea that all pornography carries with it like a negative connotation nowadays. I'll come back to that idea at the very end of this very short little PowerPoint. So one of the biggest things that Salazar talks about, the central theme among a lot of arguments that he brings up against pornography, is that it causes harm to women. So here are some, this is not an exhaustive list, but here are some of the ways that women tend to be harmed by pornography. One is they are typically objectified in pornography. Some people think that that's harmful to not just to the women that are objectified in the actual material itself, but that it also reinforces certain kinds of attitudes toward women and toward their sort of place in a broadly patriarchal society, right? Namely, a social role that involves kind of servility to men's sexual desires. Women who help to create this content often wind up doing so because they are in a somewhat or severely desperate social situation. Sometimes they're coerced into participation through the threat of abuse or other things. The bottom line is there are a lot of women who are involved in the creation of this content who don't really want to be, and people who are like sort of maybe the producers or directors or whomever is helping to put this stuff together, take advantage of their lack of options, right, to get them to do things they might not otherwise be willing to do, or get them to do it for less money, right? And something I alluded to earlier is that in this content, especially if you look back at the historical stuff, pre-internet days, women are almost always in subordinate or servile roles in pornography. They are very rarely in dominant positions, and the way they're portrayed is sort of like their main role is to fulfill male sexual fantasies and satisfy male sexual desires. And lastly, some people have argued that pornography violates women's rights to equality and possibly also their rights to free speech. Catherine McKinnon is definitely the most prominent person who is argued along these lines. This is all of these arguments in tandem should create a fairly strong impression that when it comes to the arguments against the permissibility of pornography, it's not strictly there is a sense, obviously, in which men could also be objectified in pornography and could be vulnerable in certain contexts to some of these same concerns about exploitation. But just historically, pornography has been radically disproportionately bad for women, right? It has played, it has generally, because of the way the market works, most pornography has been made for men as the primary, with the target, that's the target market, they're the primary consumers, and as a result, women have been in this role of often playing out and fulfilling male sexual fantasies and desires in these productions. So the result of that asymmetry between how the two, between how men and women are portrayed in this content has played a pretty significant role in how the arguments about pornography historically have been presented and evaluated. And I want to stress here, these arguments have some real considerable merit. There is, I'm hesitant to use the word evidence. There are a lot of past productions of this material that are guilty of all of the things on this list, or certainly at least the first three. McKinnon's argument is a little more complex and a little bit more controversial. Whether or not pornography is inherently bad remains like an open question on this view, but historically this kind of, the pornography that has so deeply inculcated and reinforced these kinds of pernicious gender norms, and persistently objectified women, that stuff just looks really bad. I don't really have a lot of fancy explanation to give here. It's just that seems really bad and should carry some significant moral weight as to how we evaluate the ethics of a lot of pornographic content. Here are some other concerns that come up, and this goes a little bit beyond what's in the reading. One, as I mentioned, is I mentioned how it can reinforce certain gender stereotypes about women, but it also can do the same for men. because men in pornography tend to be, I don't know, they seem like they're almost Neanderthals sometimes. There's a lot of grunting. There's a lot of really overtly aggressive behavior. There's not really a lot of intimacy between the parties, or at least, um, again, a lot of stuff that's historically been produced. That's the case. Neither, in my view, neither men or women get great treatment in terms of like how they're presented in most of this material. It can also create unrealistic expectations about sex, particularly for people who are young or impressionable. A lot of pornography is created under conditions that, or excuse me, it portrays conditions in which sex occurs that is not realistic, in many cases not healthy or not safe. And that's obviously can be a problem nowadays when you have lots and lots of teenagers who are accessing pornography through the internet. It would have been more difficult for them to get a hold of this material 30 or 40 years ago, but that's not the world we live in anymore. And another one that I'll point out here is that you can make a virtue ethical argument against pornography, because you could say that watching it cultivates vices associated with things like the objectification of other people, uncontrolled lust, or just being lecherous, or for lack of a better word, like creepy or whatever. And also, there might be something wrong with fantasizing about certain types of immoral behavior. So lots of pornography involves like simulated voyeurism or adultery or non-consensual sex or various other kinds of morally questionable activities. You might, like, obviously some people would say, like, yeah, but that's just role-playing, that's just harmless fantasy and so on. But if you're glamorizing those kinds of things mentally, one, it might make you more likely to seek out that kind of thing in real life. But two, maybe that's a kind of character disposition that you don't want to be reinforcing and cultivating in yourself. Maybe you want to try to redirect your sort of sexual energy towards fantasies that are more reciprocal or involve behavior that's moral and legal and so on. Right? There's a virtue ethical case here to be made that viewing at least certain types of pornography may sort of promote vices and maybe contribute to immoral behavior. So why exactly, given all these like kind of concerns, why is it that we tolerate pornography in society? Salazar brings up three considerations. One is just basic respect for personal autonomy. Obviously, Salazar says we should be concerned about the production of pornography that occurs without the consent of all participants, because that would not be respecting personal autonomy. As far as the content goes, he says you should have a right to free expression. You shouldn't we should in general not police people's artistic freedom in some sense. We should allow people to speak and act and produce content freely, and we're all better off as a result of having those rights. The main context in which we can restrict those things is when there's a clear harm being done. But Salazar says something in this essay that's pretty controversial. He essentially says that there is no clear link between the existence or consumption of pornography and the presence of harm. I think the word he uses is inconclusive. He says like something like the research on this has been inconclusive. There is pretty compelling evidence that there is a correlation between, say, watching violent pornography and committing sexual violence. Now, there's a question here about how the causal link works. Is it that people who are prone to sexual violence are more prone to watch violent pornography, or is it the other way around? There's some debate about that. But I guess I would say that argument works for some types of pornography, perhaps. But there are some psychologists who would argue that the link between harm done to human beings and certain types of pornography is actually pretty strong. There is also the concern that pornography often has connections to human trafficking and other types of just gross and unsavory practices, right? And even if the creation of pornography isn't inherently wrong, you might be concerned that its connection to those other activities, which look like they are clearly wrong, that's a problem, right? And that might be grounds enough to restrict its production or something like that. You could try to make that sort of argument. But in any event, again, this is a really short article. These are the 3 reasons that are appealed to. Now, I do want to flag a couple of things that are worth acknowledging that go beyond the scope of this article. One is pornography is just not the same as it was 30 or 40 years ago. So I just want to consider a few examples of like pornography that exists that maybe is not going to be as clearly vulnerable to these kinds of arguments as other stuff. So one would be, if you're into like female domination, right? That is a niche of pornography where women are in the dominant role, right? And it's usually the men who are the sort of servile or subordinate individuals. It's hard, to me at least, to say that that's a case where the women are being objectified or portrayed as servile or whatever, right? That's a tough sell. It seems like that's the exact opposite of what's going on. Now, obviously, that's a niche area of pornography. It's not, I wouldn't call that mainstream, but it is an example of something where it's not clear that some of the historical arguments about the way women are portrayed, it's not as clear to me that that kind of thing is going to be vulnerable to those kinds of concerns. Or if it is, it's going to have to be a very roundabout argument. It's not going to be obvious. Right? It's not obvious. There's going to have to be some kind of elaboration provided to make that connection. Another thing you might wonder about, given the rise, I had the logo for on the title page, the logo for OnlyFans, right? So amateur porn, something that really didn't exist in much capacity, say 40 or 50 years ago, is now really, really common because pretty much anybody can use a cell phone, take a few explicit videos, and upload them to a site like OnlyFans or Pornhub or any of a variety of sort of YouTube-like adult content sites. So one of the questions you might have is, does amateur porn, especially if it's made by, like a married couple, say, or something like that, are there going to be the same kinds of concerns about presentation or exploitation of the people involved or whatever? A fair amount of the time, it seems like the answer would be no, right? There could obviously be situations where maybe it's an abusive relationship or something. That's at least possible. But there are a lot of situations where it's, if it's just two people who are doing this sort of thing as like a hobby or something, it's harder to make those kinds of some of these kinds of arguments that have been made historically about that, at least with regard to that particular content. It would also be far, far less likely, if we're just talking about amateur pornography, it'd be far less likely that those people or that their content is going to somehow be connected to human trafficking or the sex industry more broadly. So that kind of argument is going to be harder to make as well. And then there's also stuff that doesn't even involve people at all, right? So now, again, largely because we have the presence of the internet, you got all this stuff that exists where it's hand drawn or it's animated or it's in virtual reality or whatever, where no actual people are involved in the sexual acts, right? It's just a digital representation of a person. And it'd be really hard to say that an actual human being, a real person, is being objectified or exploited or whatever in the creation of that content. I mean, I don't know, maybe there'd be a case where the voice actors for an animated thing are underpaid or something, but there's nothing special about, there would be nothing special about that, right? That same thing could arise with respect to like anybody working on an animated anything, right? Could potentially be underpaid for their job. There wouldn't be anything unique there about the fact that it was adult content. You've also got cases where the content that's being drawn or animated or whatever doesn't even involve like human beings, right? Like, or at least like you got all kinds of fantasy stuff involving I don't know, dwarves, elves, orcs, whatever you can imagine. It's probably out there somewhere. And this raises further questions, right? Because it's like, not only is there no real person that's involved here, but there's not even like a corresponding like anything in human society. I don't know. It just, it gets complicated, right? So if you're trying to think about like the arguments against the permissibility of pornography in that context, there might still be certain kinds of activities that you could make that virtue ethical argument I had a couple of slides back about. So maybe it's just wrong to, gravitate toward sexual violence, even if it's virtual sexual violence, or even if it involves like, species or whatever that don't actually exist. But for a fair amount of stuff, a lot of the arguments that are on those previous slides, it doesn't look like it's going to apply to that. So one of the things about the kind of the ethics of pornography, I don't think that the literature on this has really caught up with the reality of what pornography in 2022 looks like, because so much of it is not going to easily map onto the historical concerns. A fair amount of it still will, but there's lots of stuff that won't, and for the most part, that stuff hasn't really been written about all that much. So this was a short little presentation, but the article is only like, it's 4 pages. They're fairly dense, but it's only 4 pages. So hopefully this gives you an idea about kind of some of the arguments in this area. I mainly included this as a topic because, one, pornography is often consumed by college-age students, particularly men. But 2, for those of you who are interested in this topic, for, say, writing a term paper about it or something like that, wanted you to have some ideas that you might kick around, or some leads on where you might go to dig into this material in a little more depth. So I'll see you all next time. I'm hoping that I don't have any more makeup lectures for this semester, but you never know.